Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chav Zayin, Daf 27 of Masechta Rosh Hashanah. Friends, today we talk more about the shofar, about using gold on shofars and silver and things like that. What if the shofar has a crack in it or a split? So these are kind of the sugyas that we're going to talk about today. Friends, let's start at the top of Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, all the way at the top, Ufiv Mitzupa Zov. So the Mishnah had said that on Rosh Hashanah, the mouthpiece of the shofar is covered in gold. So, effectively, Gemara ve'atani tzipeu zov b'makam anochas piv pasul shelo b'makam anochas piv kosher. 1 second, we have a brisa that says that if you cover the shofar in gold by the mouthpiece, it's taka pasul shelo b'makam anochas piv kosher. But if you put gold on the shofar at a different part of the shofar, like not at the mouthpiece, okay, that's fine. Interesting. So Abai says, interestingly, when the Mishnah says ufiv mitupazov, that its mouth is covered in gold, it doesn't actually mean that the mouthpiece is covered in gold, apparently, according to Abai. And maybe near the mouthpiece, I don't know, whatever it is, but Abai is saying, look, as we see in the Brisa, if the mouthpiece is actually covered in gold, it's not a problem. No, it's not kosher. It is a problem. It's not kosher because then you're blowing into the gold. You're not blowing into the shofar. So therefore, says Abaye, when the Mishnah says that the mouth is covered in gold, I guess it does. So it says Abaye, it doesn't actually mean the mouth because that would be a problem. So I don't know, maybe it's near the mouth or something, but whatever it is, it can't be the actual mouthpiece because that cannot be gold. And the Mishnah had said that, so in the Beis HaMikdash at least, they would blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and on either side of the shofar there would be the trumpets, the chatzotzos. Friends, you hear the kasha? How can you hear two sounds at once? But we learn in the Brisa, Zocher v'Shomer b'dibur echad that Zocher is Yom HaShabbos L'Kacho and Shomer is Yom HaShabbos L'Kacho were both said at the same exact instant. Which is something that, humans cannot do. You can't speak two things at once. And you can't hear two things at once. So the Gemara asks, so we see from Zocher v'Shomer that you can't hear two things at once. So if that's the case, how could they be blowing the shofar and the chatzotzos at the same time? You're not going to be able to hear the shofar. And for the Gemara, l'chachmayich b'shofar. So that is, so that's why the shofar extends past the trumpets, right? The Mishnah had said that in Rosh Hashanah, you blow the shofar and there would be trumpets on either side. And the shofar, the blast of the shofar extends longer than the blast of the trumpets, so that at least at the end you're hearing the shofar alone. The member to say the chishama sof tkiya below tchilas tkiya yotza. To say that if you hear the end of the blast, even though you didn't hear the beginning of the blast, since it was together with the chatzotzos, nonetheless that's okay, right? So the beginning of the blast, when he starts blasting the shofar, the trumpets are being played at the same time. So you hear the shofar and the trumpets, you can't actually distinguish the shofar. But at the end, the trumpets stop and the shofar continues. And then you get to hear the shofar alone. And therefore, right, Shoma Sof Tkiya, if he hears the end of the blast, below Tchilas Tkiya, even though he didn't hear the first part of the blast because the trumpets were blasting at the same time, Yotza is nonetheless Yotza. And then at the same time, Tchilas tkiya below sof tkiya yotza. I was somewhere the other night, they had tequila, but I said, no, I'm not drinking tequila because I already drink wine. And I knew that wouldn't be a good idea. So, memele tchilas tkiya besof tkiya yotza. And so just like if you, even though I like tequila, anyways, So if you, even though you didn't hear the beginning of the blast, but you hear the end of the blast, so it's okay. And then Memele says the Gemara, if you hear the beginning of the blast, even if you don't hear the end of the blast, that's also your Yotze. Fine. Tashma, come in here. Taka b'rishona umashach b'shniya kishtayim. So the Gemara says, 1 second. We have a brisa that says, so basically, okay, whoa, da-da-da. So the way that we do shofar is a little bit different than the way that they did shofar. So we do shofar, I don't know, we have a whole mahalach, right? We like blow a bunch before Musaf, and then we blow a bunch, some people during the silent Shmoneh, we do a whole thing. Basically, apparently the way that they would do it is that after Malchias, they would, I guess that they would blow I guess they would like blow, I don't know, before Malchias, and then after Malchios, and then before Zichronos, and after Zichronos, and I guess before Shofaros and after Shofaros. But basically, so what does the Mishnah say? What does the Brisa say? So Taka Barishona. So he blew the shofar before Malchios, okay? Umashach Bashnia Kishtayim. And then after Malchios, of course, Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofaros being the three sections of Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. So then when he blew the shofar after Malchias, he blew long enough that it could serve, theoretically, both as the blast after Malchios as well as the blast before Zichronis. And we say, nonetheless, even though technically speaking, he did a Tkiya Gedola that was long enough that it, in terms of length, could have been 2 blasts worth of length, of shofar blast, and it could have theoretically served as both the blast after Malchias as well as the blast before Zichronis, but nonetheless, it only counts as one blast, this one long blast. Amai, but how come? Tisalak le betarte. But if we're saying that you can ki'ilu just chaparayim parts of the blast, meaning if we're saying that when you blow the shofar together with the chatzotzes, so you can't hear the shofar alone, but the last part of this blast we could treat as the part that you're hearing the shofar with, right? The part that extends past the trumpets. So we see that we can sort of like take a part of the blast and use that. So then why don't we say that when you have this Tkiya Gedola, we could sort of take the first part of the blast and use it as the blast post Malchias, and then take the second part of the blast and use it as the as the part that's pre Zichronis. So the Gemara is asking, well, and yet we say that you cannot do that, and that's the Gemara's kasha. Meaning, when it comes to the shofar that extends past the chatzotzes, we're taking the last part of that blast and saying, okay, that's going to be the shofar blast, just the part that the shofar extended alone. And yet, when it comes to this long Tkiya Gedola after Malchias, we don't say, well, let's just take this part of the blast and use it as the post Malchias blast, and let's take this part of the blast and use it as the pre-Zichronis blast. We don't do that. So the question is, how come when it comes to extending the shofar past the chatzotzos, we are willing to take that portion of the blast and saying, this is the shofar that we're being yotze with, and yet, when it comes to doing a Tkiya Gedola after Malchias, we do not say, well, we'll take this portion of the blast for Malchias and this portion of the blast for Zichronis. That's the Gemara's kasha. So, and for the Gemara, Psuke Tkiyos Me'adadi Lo Paskinin. Well, we're not going to take one blast and break it up into different parts. We're not going to do that. Right? So when it comes to the shofar that extends past the chatzotzos, we'll say, look, as long as part of the blast extended past the chatzotzos, we can use that. But we're not going to take one blast and treat it as if we mamish break it into 2 and say this is for Malchios and this is for Zichronos. That we're not going to do. Fine. Tashma, come in here. Hatukei l'socha bor, o l'socha dus, o l'socha pitos, im kol shofar shama yotza, vim kol avar shama lo yotza. Says a brisa. Let's read that again. Hatukei l'socha bor. If a fellow blows shofar into a pit, o l'socha dos, or he blows shofar into a cistern, o l'socha pitos, or into like a big barrel, im kol shofar shama. So if what he's hearing is the shofar, so then yotza, givaldig, he's yotze. Vim kol avar shama. But if what he's hearing is the sound of an echo, well then lo yotza, then he's not yotze. He's got to hear the shofar, not the echo. Now, but amai, frekti gemara, why is he not yotze? If we're saying that all you need to do is hear part of the blast, so leipok betchilas tkiya mikami de la'arbev kala. So why don't we say that this fellow, even when blowing the shofar into the pit, and hearing the echo, but there must have been the sound of the shofar before it all got mixed together in one big echo, but there must have been at least one part where he was hearing the blast, he was hearing the shofar. And if we're saying that even hearing sort of, just a part of the shofar, whether it's the shofar that extends past the chatzotzos, or in this case we want to argue the part of the shofar before all the sounds got mixed together in an echo, shouldn't that be enough? So who cares if it turns out being an echo? But there was that part of the blast before it all got echoey. So, and for the Gemara, Ella, rather, Tartekali michad gaver lo mishtamoy, mitre gaver mishtamoy. And for the Gemara, okay, 1 second. What was our original question, friends? I'll tell you. The original question was, we have this brayso that says that the Eibishter said Zohar and Shomer right together. Something that a human is unable to speak two things at once, and also we can't hear two things at the same time. And the question was, well, if you can't hear Zohar v'Shomer, if you can't hear two things at the same time, so then how come we're going to blow the shofar at the same time as the chatzotzos? You're not going to hear the shofar. That was the Gemara's kasha. We tried to say, well, that's why the shofar extends past the chatzotzos. We're having a bit of a hard time with that answer. The Gemara says, you know what? You know why you could blow shofar at the same time as the chatzotzos? Because the chatzotzos and the shofar are coming from different people. Kilu, what the brayso was saying earlier is that by Zohar v'Shomer is that one person who's saying two things, you can't hear both of them. But if you have two people saying two things, you can hear both of them. And here also, if you have the shofar and the chatzotzos at the same time, it's okay. They're coming from different people. You could hear the chatzotzos, you could hear the shofar. It's no problem. But effective Gemara, but is that true? Just because you hear the sounds coming from two different fellows, that all of a sudden means that you'll be able to hear it? We learn in a brayso. B'Torah, when it comes to reading from the Torah, echad korei ve'echad metargim, uvilvad shelo yeh echad korei v'shnayim metargimin. So when it comes to reading the Torah, so you have one fellow reading the Torah, and then you have a fellow translating it. But don't have one fellow reading and then two people translating at the same time. So we see that you can't have two people translating at the same time, even though it's two separate people. So the implication being that even two separate people speaking at the same time, you would be unable to hear them both. And then what follows is that even though you have one person blowing or two people blowing the chatzotzos and another person blowing the shofar, you won't be able to hear them. Just like you won't be able to hear the two translations at the same time, you won't be able to hear the shofar together with the chatzotzos. And for the Gemara, holo damya ela l'seifa. The Gemara says, wait a second, but if you keep on reading in that brayso, it says, behalal of Megillah, that when it comes to halal, and when it comes to reading the Megillah, on Purim, afilu asara korin, even if you have 10 people reading, that's no problem. Amakim the choviv, yoiv daite. So we see that something that's beloved upon a fellow, such as Hallel, or reading the Megillah on Purim, it's beloved upon a fellow, yoiv daite. Therefore, he's going to pay attention and hear what he needs to hear. And you can even have 10 people reading at once, and it's no problem. You'll still be able to hear it. Hachanami, here also, when it comes to hearing the shofar, Kiv Nechoviv, since it's beloved upon a fellow to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, Yoiv Daite V'Shama, he's going to pay attention, and he's going to hear what he needs to hear. He's going to hear the shofar, even when it's together with the chatzotzos. Well, if that's the case, then why do you have to extend the shofar? If we're saying that even if you don't extend the shofar, even when the shofar is blasting at the same time as the chatzotzos, you'll still be able to hear the shofar. So if that's the case, then why do you have to extend the shofar past the chatzotzos? Well, that's just for a side reason, to make it clear that the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah is the shofar, and that's why we extend the shofar past the chatzotzos to sort of highlight it and to show that the mitzvah of the day is the shofar. But in terms of being able to hear the shofar, you can even hear the shofar while the chatzotzos are blowing or blasting, because it's beloved upon you to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, so you're going to make sure that that's what you hear. The Mishnah had said, Uvitanios, and on fast days, v'shozchorim kfufin, they would blow from ram's horns that were bent, ufiv mitzupa kesev, and its mouth was covered in silver. Ma'ishnahosum dezov, u'ma'ishnahochu de kesev. How come by Rosh Hashanah the shofar is covered in gold, and by fast days, it's covered in silver. One answer we can give is, well, whenever they would gather people together, so then it would be with silver. The pasuk says by the chatzotzres, make chatzotzres trumpets out of silver. It'll be for you to gather the congregation and for traveling. So we see that silver is associated with gathering, and on fast days you're using the trumpets, the shofar, to gather together the people. Okay, fine. So therefore you would use silver. Or if one will say, or you could say, well, the Torah is having mercy, is being sensitive on the money of the people. Right? If the people are going to have to spend their own money on this gold and this silver, so therefore we'd rather save the expense and say silver is just fine. Hasam nami naibid the kesef. Well, if that's the case, then by Rosh Hashanah also we should put silver on the shofar, not gold, if we want to save money. Hafilu achi kvod yom tiv adif. So the Gemara says, true. But even so, out of honor of the Yom Tiv, so on Rosh Hashanah we still use gold. But on fast days, where it's not, a particularly, festive day, so rather use silver and save the expense. Rav Papa Bar Shmuel saver the mebed uvdo kimas nisan. So Rav Papa Bar Shmuel figured that he would do like our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? That together with the shofar, they would also blow the chatzotzres. Now I'd imagine in most of the synagogues that we go to, they don't blow chatzotzres on Rosh Hashanah. I've never been to a synagogue where they blew chatzotzres on Rosh Hashanah as far as I can remember. They just blow the shofar. Now, Rav Papa Bar Shmuel thought, he figured that he would do like our Mishnah, that in addition to blowing shofar, they would also blow the chatzotzres. Rave said to him, Lo amru ela b'mikdash. The chatzotzres was only in the Beis HaMikdash. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, it's the shofar alone. Tanan Yachi, we tackle it in a brisa like this. Bamed var mamurim b'mikdash. When do we blow the chatzotzres together with the shofar in the Beis HaMikdash? Aval b'gvulin, but outside the Beis HaMikdash, mokum sheish chatzotzres ein shofar. In a place where there's chatzotzres, there's no shofar. What does that mean? On a fast day where they blow the trumpets, so they would not blow the shofar, only the trumpets. Mokum sheish shofar ein chatzotzres. And where they blow shofar, they wouldn't blow trumpets, i.e. on Rosh Hashanah, it would just be the shofar, not the trumpets. And Reb Chalafta in Sipori, and Reb Chanani ben Trajon, one of the Asar Rugei Malchus, the father-in-law of Reb Meir, the father of Bruria. So he, in Sichni, would do like our Mishnah. So Reb Chalafta and Sipori and Reb Chanani ben Trajon and Sichni, they would do like our Mishnah, that in addition to blowing the shofar, they would blow the chatzotzes. And when the rabbis, the sages, found out about this, Amru, they said, Lo hayu noagin kain, ela b'shayir mizoch of harabayis. They would only do the chatzotzes on Rosh Hashanah by the eastern entrance to the Temple Mount Bilvad alone, not outside of there. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it would just be the shofar, not the chatzotzes. Amru Rava, b'tem Reb Shua ben Levi, my kra'ah, says Rava, some takasei Reb Shua ben Levi, what's a pasuk for this? The chsiv, as the pasuk says, Ma'chatzotzes v'kol shofar, the sound of the trumpets together with the shofar, harir lifnei melech Hashem. You would blow before the king Hashem. Lifnei melech Hashem u'deba inan chatzotzes v'kol shofar avol ba'amalo. Yes, in the Beis HaMikdash, in front of the Eibishter, that is where there's shofar together with chatzotzes, but outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it's just the shofar, not the trumpets. So the Mishnah had said that Yovel, Yom Kippur of the Yovel year, is the same as Rosh Hashanah when it comes to the ram's horn, or the horn that we use, the shofar that we use, as well as for the prayers that usually on Yom Kippur there's 7 brachos in the Musaf Shmoneh Esrei, but on Yovel on Yom Kippur of Yovel, so then it's take 9 brachos in the Shmoneh Esrei, like Rosh Hashanah. Reb Shmuel Bar Yitzchok says, Reb Shmuel Bar Yitzchok, oh, what does he say? Like which Tana do we pray nowadays in Musaf Shmoneh Esrei that today is the beginning of your actions? Zikaron Yom Rishon, it is a remembrance to the first day. Kiman Reb Eliezer, it's like Reb Eliezer the Amar b'Tishrei Nivra Olam, who says that the world was created in Tishrei. So when we say that today is the beginning of your creations, essentially, it's like Reb Eliezer who says that the world was created in Tishrei. Most of Rav Eina. Rav Eina asked the kasha. Shava Yovel Rosh Hashanah, that Yom Kippur and Yovel is the same, is equal to Rosh Hashanah. The Tkiya v'the brachas, for blowing shofar, right, for how we blow shofar, as well as for the brachas. V'ayika ze hayom tchilas ma'asecha zikaron liyom rishon, de b'Rosh Hashanah yisa v'yovel lesa. But one second, how could it be that we're saying this prayer of ze hayom tchilas ma'asecha zikaron liyom rishon, that today was the beginning of the creation, and we're saying it's like Reb Eliezer, that on today the world was created, but at the same time we say that on Yom Kippur of Yovel, we would say the same prayers as Rosh Hashanah. Now, if in the prayers in Rosh Hashanah we're saying that today was the world that the day was created, then how could you say that on Yom Kippur of Yovel? The world wasn't created on Yom Kippur. So, Kikatoni Ashayra. So, and for the Gemara, it's talking about the other brachas, not including Zayom Tchilas Ma'asecha. We wouldn't say that on Yom Kippur because it wouldn't be correct. Alright? Rav Shisha bar Davidi Masni Ochi. Rav Shisha bar Davidi teaches in the following way. Amar Shmuel Bar Yitzchok. Says Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchok. Hodetnan, that which we learn in our Mishnah, Shabbat Yovel Rosh Hashanah L'Tkiya v'the brachas, that Yovel, that Yom Kippur of Yovel is just like Rosh Hashanah with regard to the blasts, as well as the blessings in Musaf. Kiman, who's that like? To look Rabbi Eliezer, that can't be like Rabbi Eliezer. Di Rabbi Eliezer, came the Amar b'Tishrei Nivra Olam, ha'ikazayim tchilas ma'asecha zikaron liyom rishon. Because according to Rabbi Eliezer, when we say the bracha on Rosh Hashanah of Zayom tchilas ma'asecha zikaron liyom rishon, that this was the day that was the beginning of your handiwork, so Rabbi Eliezer would understand that to mean that b'Tishrei Nivra Olam, this is the day that the world was created. And if that's the case, so then how would Rabbi Eliezer be able to say that Rosh Hashanah is the same as Yom Kippur of Yovel, but Yom Kippur of Yovel, how would you be able to say Zayom Tchilas Ma'asecha Zikaron Liyom Rishon? The world wasn't created on Yom Kippur. So the Rosh Hashanah Yisov Yovel Lesa, that only makes sense on Rosh Hashanah, not on Yom Kippur. Kigatani Ashayra, so you can even say that the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, and just that when we say that there's a parallel between the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's not talking about Zayom Tchilas Ma'asecha, it's talking about the other prayers. Okay, fine, sounds alright, good to me. Let's go weiter. Says the Mishnah, Shofar Shenizdok. If you have a shofar that got a crack in it, I think the assumption is that it like split right down I talk of a shofar right here. Alright. But if it gets like split along like the whole length, and now it's like 2 pieces. Alright. Vidavko posel, but you just take some glue and you glue it together. Posel. Doesn't work. Tibik shivrei shofar is posel. If you took a whole bunch of broken shofars and you glued them all together and made up as a Frankenstein shofar, posel. Doesn't work. Alright. Nike v'sosmo, if it got a hole in it, so you filled in the hole. Ima'ake v'satkiya, so if it's going to affect the sound of the shofar, so then posel. V'imlav kosher. But if it doesn't affect the sound of the shofar, so then it's kosher. As we saw earlier, a fellow blows a shofar into a pit, or into a cistern, or into a barrel. Im kol shofar shama, if what he hears is the sound of the shofar, so then yotza, no problem. Im kol avara shama lo yotza. But if what he hears is the echo, well then, memele, it's a problem. We don't want you hearing an echo, we want you hearing the shofar. A fellow was passing behind a synagogue, or he lived in close proximity to a synagogue, shofar, and he heard the sound of the shofar, or the sound of the Megillah on Purim. So if he has kavanah, if he says, look, I'm going to be Yotzei now the mitzvah, at least that's the assumption, I'm going to be Yotzei now the mitzvah of Megillah or of Shofar, so Givaldik. But if he didn't have any kavanah, so then he's not Yotzei. The Gemara is going to get into, is the kavanah to be Yotzei or kavanah to hear, whatever it is. But he has to have some kind of a kavanah for something. And you can have two people, they both hear the shofar, and yet one of them had kavanah, the other one didn't have kavanah. The one who has kavanah is Yotzei, the one who did not have kavanah is not Yotzei. Tana Rabbanan, says the Gemara, the rabbis taught, Aruch v'ktsaro kosher. If you have a shofar that is long and you shorten it, so then it's kosher. Gerdo ve'amido al gildo kosher. If you have a shofar that you scraped away its layers and you just left one thin layer of shofar, kosher. Tzipeu zav b'makom hanochas pe pasul. If you covered the shofar in gold, by the mouthpiece, pasul. Shlo b'makom hanochas pe kosher. But if you covers it in gold, not by the mouthpiece, kosher. Tzipeu zav mi b'fnim pasul. If he plated it in gold inside of the shofar, pasul. Mibachutz, if he plates it in gold outside of on the outside of the shofar, im nishtana kolo mikmoshaya pasul. So if it affects the sound, so then pasul v'imlav kosher. But if it doesn't, so if you put gold on the outside of the shofar and it does not affect the sound, it's the same old sound, so givaldik, it's kosher. Nikev v'sosmo. If there was a hole, if there was a hole kind of thing, it was a very holy shofar. If there was a hole in the shofar, v'sasmo, and you filled it in, if it affects the sound, so then pasul. V'imlav kosher. If it doesn't affect the sound, b'chlaus, then it's kosher. Nosan shofar b'soch shofar. If you put one shofar inside of another shofar, im kopnimi shama yotze. If you hear the sound of the inner shofar, so then it's your yotze. But if what you're hearing is the sound of the outer shofar, you're not Yotzei. Again, so you put one shofar inside of another shofar. If what you're hearing is the sound of the inner shofar, givaldik, because the inner shofar, you're just hearing the sound of that shofar. But if what you're hearing is the sound of the outer shofar, it's a problem because the outer shofar has the inner one inside of it, so you're not really hearing the full sound of the outer shofar because it's being not interrupted, but effective. What's it called when you tampered with? I can't think of the word. Obstructed by whatever. Somehow, if the outer shofar has the inner shofar in it, so it's you're not really hearing the full effect of the outer shofar because it's being hindered. I don't know what the word is, by interfered with by the inner shofar. Let's go by to Tana Rabbanon. The rabbis taught, Gerdo beimi b'fnim beimi b'chutz kosher. If he scraped away the layers from the shofar, whether from the outside, whether from the inside, kosher. Gerdo v'amido al gildo kosher. If he scraped away the shofar till there was just one thin layer left, kosher. Hinech shofar b'soch shofar. If he puts one shofar and another shofar, I think maybe interfere was a good word. Im kol pnimi shama yotze. If he hears the sound from the inner shofar, he's yotze. But if he hears the sound from the outer shofar, he's not Yotzei because the sound from the outer shofar is being interfered with by the inner shofar. I feel like interfere works. Hofko, if he turns it inside out, we're going to have to, or flips it around. We're going to explain what that means. V'takabo lo Yotza, and he blew a blast from it, he's not Yotzei. Amar Papa says, Papa lo tema dehafke kikituna. So when we say that if he flips around the shofar, he's not Yotzei, don't think that what that means is that he kind of like turns it inside out, as if you take your garment, your shirt, and you turn it inside out. That's not what it means. Rather, he took the thinner part and made it wider, and the wider part and he made it thinner. If you look at a shofar, so there's the mouthpiece, which is very thin, and then where the sound comes out of, it's wider. So if you somehow like use hot water, use like heat to make the mouthpiece wide and make the other part, which is wide, thin, and he basically reversed it, and now he's blowing from what was once the outer part, the wider part. So we're saying that doesn't work. My time I'll come kidur of masna, damer of masna, ve'avarta derech avaroso ba'inan. It says by blowing the shofar ve'avarta, you're going to pass it. It has to be by way that it would like pass the way that it was like connected and to the head of the ram, and the ram would like pass with it, I guess. Alright. Well, don't make the thinner part wider and the wider part thinner. Alright, let's go weiter. Dibek Shivei Shofar is possible if you made a Frankenstein shofar by gluing together random parts. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hosif Olav Kolshu, if a fellow adds an extension to the shofar, he makes it longer. Bein Bemino Ben Shilo Bemino Pasul. Whether this extension is with, I guess, more ram horn, or whether it's with some other random material, either way, Pasul. Nikev, if it got a hole in it, Visasmo, and you filled it in, Ben Bemino Ben Shilo Bemino, whether you're filling it in with ram horn material or whether some other random material, Pasul. Reb Nosson Amar says Reb Nosson, Bemino kosher. If you fill it in with ram horn, so it's kosher. Shelo Bemino Pasul, but if it is a different material, then it's possible. Bemino kosher, Amar Reb Yochanan. So when we say that if you fill in the hole with ram horn material, it's kosher according to Reb Nosson. So then Amar Reb Yochanan says Reb Yochanan v'ushin ishtaya rubo, but that is that I guess the majority of the shofar is still intact. Michal de shelo b'mino, which implies that if you're filling it in with other material, afal pishin ishtaya rubo, even though most of the rest of the horn remains intact, pasul. It's pasul. Okay. Ige de masni la sefer, those who mentioned Rabbi Yochanan the sefer, which is shelo b'mino pasul. Then when we say that if you fill it in with a different material, it's pasul. On Rabbi Yochanan v'usha nifchas rubo. That's only as long as most of it is, like there's a really big hole and it's the majority of it. Mechlad de b'mino, which implies that if you're filling it in with ram horn material, alpha pishin nifchas rubo, even though the hole was like most of the shofar, nonetheless it's kosher. All right. If you cover it in gold inside of the shofar, it's pasul mibachutz. Whereas if you cover it in gold outside of the shofar, im nishtana kolum mikimoshoya pasul from lav kosher. So if by putting gold on the outside of the shofar, now it's going to affect by putting gold on the outside of the shofar, it's going to affect the sound. That's a problem. If it doesn't affect the sound, then it's okay. All right. Nizdak leorko pasul. So if the shofar gets split along its length, it's pasul. Lerochba, but along its width, so then im nishtayir boshir tkiya kosher. As long as there remains on the shofar enough to blow it, so then it's kosher, right? So I don't know. Okay, seder. So along the width of it, I don't know. Imagine taking a saw and just not sawing it in half along its length, but along its width. I don't know that I made anything better with that description, but anyways, as long as there's enough to hold it, so then it's kosher. If I'm not pasul, but if not, then it's pasul. Well, enough to blow with it, so then it's kosher. If not pasul, how much is enough to blow? Perish Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel explains enough that you can hold it and you can see it on either side of your fist. All right. If the sound of the shofar was thin or thick or rough, all right, kosher. Because any sound is kosher by a shofar. They sent to Avud Shmuel. Kadcho, if he drilled a hole in it, v'takabo, and he blew it, yotza. All right. The assumption is that kilu, he blew, like he drilled open the mouthpiece. So pshita, isn't this obvious? Kulunami mikadach kod kulu. Every shofar you have to drill a hole for a mouthpiece. So Amar Vashi shekadcho b'zachruso. Ma'odetem min b'mino chotzetz komashmalon. So says Rashi, well, no, basically the way apparently it works is that there's a bone that goes from the head of the ram inside of the horn. And generally what you do is you just remove that bone from the shofar, and now you memela have your mouthpiece. But he didn't do that. He drilled into that bone a hole. So I might think that the remaining part of that bone would be like min b'mino, and it would be a chatzitza. So we're saying, no, it's not a chatzitza, it is okay. That's what we're saying. Friends, that was Daf Chov Zayin. We'll hold it there. Of Masechta Rosh Hashanah. Friends, what do we talk about? We talked about at the beginning of the Daf, if you cover a shofar, the mouthpiece of a shofar with gold, it's going to be a problem because you're going to be blowing the gold, you're not going to be blowing the shofar. Then we had an interesting question of right? The Mishnah had said that you blow the shofar and the chatzotzos at the same time. The question is, but you can't hear two things at the same time. Remember we said Shomer v'Zachor v'Dibur Echad, that Shomer and Zachor were said at the same time, and generally you're unable to hear. The Chiddush was that generally it's something that you're unable to hear. You can't hear two things at the same time. First we want to say that, well, that's why we extend the shofar past the chatzotzos, so that at least at the end you're only hearing the shofar. But we ended up having a hard time with that. And in the end we said that, well, actually when you hear the shofar, right, the two sounds coming from two people, then you can focus on one of them. And therefore you have the chatzotzos coming from one, from whoever's blowing the chatzotzos, and then you have whoever's blowing the shofar, and you could focus in on the shofar and listen to that. Okay, we said that when it comes to the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, so then we covered in gold, whereas by the fast days in silver. How come by Rosh Hashanah it's gold and by the fast days it's silver? So one answer is because, well, whenever you have a gathering, it's always going to be with silver, as we see by the chatzotzos. The other answer is that the Torah didn't want to have to, the public, to have to fund something so expensive like gold, so therefore we use silver. However, when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, which is a Yom Tiv, out of respect for the Yom Tiv, so we use gold nonetheless out of Kvod Yom Tiv. We then said that the chatzotzos with the shofar was only the Beis Hamikdash. However, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, as we do nowadays, it's only the shofar. It is not, we don't blow the chatzotzos. Now then the Mishnah went into all sorts of situations. If you have a split in the shofar, it's possible, and all that kind of stuff. Mistama, the best thing to do is really to just use a shofar that doesn't have a split in it or anything like that. Just get a good shofar and just use that. Anyways, that was Daf Chav Zayin of Masechta Rosh Hashanah. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.